17 people vanished inside the most surveilled country on Earth. Not one body was recovered. Not one name was officially acknowledged. Not one government, not Pyongyang, not Washington, ever admitted what happened to them. And the people responsible for keeping them alive spent 11 days convinced the silence was a technical problem. There is a file inside the CIA's Directorate of Operations, referenced in congressional oversight testimony, described by former senior officials in language that has never fully left the record, that does not use the word dead. It uses the phrase unaccounted for. In intelligence work, that phrase has a specific meaning. It means the agency knows something happened. It does not know what, and it has no way of finding out. 17 people are listed in that file as unaccounted for. They were not CIA officers. They were not American personnel of any kind. They were North Korean nationals, men and women living inside one of the most closed, most punitive, most surveillance-saturated systems in modern history, who had agreed, for their own reasons, to become CIA assets, to observe, to record, to report. They had been doing it for years, some of them for nearly a decade. And then, in the space of 72 hours, every single one of them disappeared. What follows is reconstructed from documented intelligence failures, congressional oversight records, and the on-record accounts of former officials who worked the Korean peninsula in that period. The specific operational names used here are composites. The pattern of failure they describe is not. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what it cost to build. North Korea is not simply a hard intelligence target. Analysts at Langley use a different category entirely, a denied area operation, a place where the normal rules of tradecraft do not apply, because the infrastructure that tradecraft depends on, freedom of movement, commercial cover, diplomatic access, simply does not exist. There are no CIA officers walking the streets of Pyongyang. There are no case officers running brush passes in the subway. The entire concept of a CIA station inside North Korea belongs to fiction. What the CIA can do, and what it had spent roughly a decade doing before this story begins, is cultivate nationals, North Korean citizens living inside the country who had agreed to observe, record, and report, each one recruited individually, each one vetted over years, each one running through a separate communication channel with no knowledge of any other asset in the network. The assets in this case were placed across 5 distinct sectors of North Korean society: military logistics, mid-level party bureaucracy, a state trading company with foreign contacts, a provincial agricultural administration, and one asset with proximity to a facility believed to be connected to the country's missile development program. That last asset, the one closest to the weapons program, had been the hardest to develop. 4 years of patient relationship building through intermediaries before a first contact was made. 3 more years before their reporting was rated reliable. 7 years for one person. 17 assets across 5 sectors represented something close to a decade of cumulative work. The financial cost was significant. The human cost, the risk carried by the assets themselves, every single day they remained active, was incalculable. Recruited assets are not CIA personnel. They are foreign nationals who have agreed to a clandestine relationship with American intelligence. They carry the full risk of that relationship: arrest, interrogation, punishment, while operating inside their own country, in their own name, without cover of any kind. The network's designers considered its greatest structural strength to be this: none of the 17 assets knew about any of the others. If one was caught, they could give up their communication method. They could describe the nature of what they were asked to report. They could not give up names they did not have. The compartmentalization was not just a security feature, it was the foundational assumption on which the entire network's survival logic rested. That assumption had never been seriously tested. The senior handler who inherited oversight of this network in 2007 was a man we will call Reardon, a placeholder designation used in the reconstructed operational review of this case. He had spent 11 years running recruited sources in countries where getting caught meant disappearing: China, Vietnam, at least one posting the CIA has never officially confirmed. By 2007, he was considered one of the most technically proficient human intelligence handlers of his generation. He understood, better than almost anyone in his section, how to keep a source alive inside a system designed to kill them. He inherited the North Korea network that year. Not all of it, no single officer ran all 17, but he was the senior handler. He signed off on protocol changes. When something looked wrong, he was the one who was supposed to say stop. What drew him to this posting, what made him willing to take on the most difficult human intelligence environment in the world, is not recorded in any document that has been made available. What is recorded is his professional assessment of the network he inherited: stable, compartmented, producing reliable product across 5 distinct sectors of North Korean society. He believed in the architecture. He had reason to. By early 2008, he had a clear picture of each of the 17. He knew which ones were reliable reporters and which ones tended toward embellishment. He knew which ones were motivated primarily by money and which appeared to have ideological components to their cooperation. He knew which ones were becoming nervous, showing small behavioral changes in their communication patterns that suggested increasing stress. 3 of the 17 were in that last category. He flagged all 3 in his operational assessment. He recommended continued monitoring. He did not recommend deactivating any of them. He would later be asked, during the post-incident review, whether he had considered what those behavioral changes might mean. He had considered it. He had concluded they were under the ordinary operational stress that any asset inside a denied area state carries indefinitely. He had seen similar patterns before, in other postings, and the sources had stabilized. He was not wrong to read the pattern that way. He was also not entirely right. There is a question that sits at the center of this story that cannot be answered from open sources, and may not be answerable at all. When Reardon inherited the network in 2007, the CIA's assessment of the North Korean security apparatus rested on a foundational belief about how the Boebu, the Ministry of State Security, was organized. The belief was that it operated on strict vertical reporting lines. Information collected by one directorate did not, as a matter of institutional design, flow laterally to another. This was not speculation. It was based on defector testimony, on signals intelligence, and on decades of careful analysis of how the regime managed internal threats. A system that survives by preventing coordination between its own citizens applies the same logic to its internal security services. No one talks to anyone they don't have to talk to. The CIA's network architecture was built on this belief. Built around it, in fact, designed specifically for an operating environment where the left hand of the security apparatus did not know what the right hand was doing. And in 2007, when Reardon took over, that belief was accurate. The question is whether it was still accurate in 2008. Because between 2007 and 2009, something inside the Boebu began to change. A quiet, internal restructuring, the kind that happens in closed bureaucracies with no press releases and no observable external indicators, that would eventually produce a capability the CIA's network had never been designed to survive. The CIA did not know this restructuring was happening. Reardon did not know. Nobody knew. And somewhere inside North Korea, in the autumn of 2007, an asset Reardon's files listed as Source 12, a man in his mid-40s working in a provincial railway administration, sent his last communication. Then, he went quiet. Reardon filed a standard incident report, cited 3 possible explanations, logged a 4th, and weighted it least likely. He was wrong about the weighting. And that single misjudgment, small, documented, bureaucratically approved within 48 hours, was the first thread that, when pulled, would eventually unravel everything. Source 12 had been active for 3 years before he stopped responding. His reporting was never spectacular. He tracked the movement of military cargo between 3 provincial rail depots, cargo manifests, loading schedules, the occasional routing anomaly that suggested something heavier or more sensitive than the official classification indicated. It was the kind of granular, unglamorous intelligence that never made it into a senior-level briefing, but that analysts prized precisely because it was consistent, verifiable against satellite imagery, and never embellished. He was not the network's most important asset, but he was an asset, and assets do not go silent without a reason. Reardon ran the standard diagnostic. The communication channel was intact. There was no technical failure. Source 12 had simply stopped using it. In the language of the operational logs, this was classified as an unscheduled communication lapse, a phrase designed to be precise without being alarming. A phrase that, in practice, meant, "We don't know what happened, and we can't find out without risking more than we're willing to risk." There were 3 explanations Reardon logged immediately. 1. Source 12 was dead, natural causes, accident, the ordinary attrition of life inside a country with limited health care and significant occupational hazard. 2. Source 12 had been arrested, not necessarily for espionage. The North Korean system generates arrests for reasons that have nothing to do with intelligence activity. 3. Source 12 had decided to stop. Fear, exhaustion, a change in personal circumstance. Assets burn out. It is more common than the institutional literature acknowledges. He logged a 4th possibility in careful, qualified language. The 4th possibility was that Source 12's silence was not about Source 12 at all, that it was about something the CIA couldn't see from the outside, something structural. He weighted it, least likely. He had 3 reasons for that weighting, all of them sound. First, the network's compartmentalization meant that a compromise of Source 12 could not logically cascade to the others. He simply did not have the information required to expose them. Second, the remaining 16 assets were all reporting normally, with no behavioral indicators of elevated stress beyond the 3 already flagged. Third, the CIA's most recent assessment of the BOIBU's organizational capacity gave no indication of cross-directorate coordination capability. The security apparatus was siloed. It had always been siloed. There was no reason to believe that had changed. 3 sound reasons, all of them based on the same underlying assumption. All of them, in that sense, one reason. The decision Reardon made in November 2007 was not to pause the network. It was a decision that required active justification, not passive acceptance. The section chief reviewed his assessment and signed off within 48 hours. Nobody in the chain of command pushed back. Nobody asked the question that the post-incident review would later identify as the question someone should have asked: if we cannot determine why Source 12 went silent, do we have sufficient confidence in our model of the threat environment to continue operating the other 16? The question was not asked. The network continued. In retrospect, this is the moment the story could have ended differently. Not easily. A network-wide stand-down would have meant months of suspended collection, significant institutional friction, and the near-certain loss of several assets who might not survive a prolonged silence from their handlers. The cost of stopping was real and visible. The cost of continuing was theoretical and invisible. When costs are distributed that way, when one side of a decision is concrete and the other is abstract, institutions almost always choose to continue. It is not a failure of judgment. It is the ordinary operation of institutional risk calculus. It is also how disasters accumulate their early momentum. By early 2008, Reardon had absorbed Source 12's loss into his operational baseline. The other 16 were producing. The priority asset near the weapons facility had stabilized after a quiet period in late 2007 and was generating reporting that Langley had flagged as significant enough to request increased contact frequency. Reardon pushed back on that request. When Langley's Korea desk asked him to increase contact frequency with the priority asset, Reardon filed a formal objection. He argued that the asset's risk profile, their proximity to sensitive facilities, the surveillance density of their operating environment, made increased contact frequency a disproportionate exposure risk. The intelligence value of more frequent reporting did not justify the additional danger to the asset. He was overruled. Not loudly, not confrontationally. The Korea desk acknowledged his concern, noted it in the record, and maintained the request. The increase was modest, one additional contact cycle per quarter, small enough that refusing to implement it would have required escalating the dispute in ways that carried their own institutional costs. He implemented it. He did not like it. He wrote in his operational notes that were not part of the formal reporting chain, that the request reflected a collection priority calculus that was not adequately accounting for asset survivability. He used the word reckless once, then crossed it out and replaced it with suboptimal. The note sat in his analog documentation. It was never formally transmitted. It was reviewed during the post-incident accountability process, and the reviewers noted it without comment. In the spring of 2008, one of Reardon's Korean-American colleagues, a former NIS analyst working alongside the CIA's Korea team in a liaison capacity, raised something in an informal meeting. She had been reviewing historical Bowibu case patterns as part of a separate analytical project. She had noticed a possible structural anomaly, a small cluster of counter-espionage cases from 2006 and 2007 that showed an unusual characteristic. The cases appeared, on the surface, to be unrelated. Different directorates, different subject profiles, different regional jurisdictions. But the timing of the arrests within each case followed a pattern she had not seen in earlier Bowibu operations, a significant delay between initial identification and arrest. Weeks, in some cases, months. She did not know what it meant. She raised it because she thought someone should be aware of it. She said it might be nothing. She said it might be a methodology shift. Reardon listened. He asked her to document it and share it with the analytical team. The document was prepared. It was circulated to a distribution list that included the Korea Analytical Desk and 2 counterintelligence officers. It was logged as received. There is no record of a formal response. In the post-incident review, one of the counterintelligence officers on the distribution list was asked whether he remembered the document. He said he remembered receiving something along those lines. He said it had not, at the time, risen to the level of a concern that warranted redirecting analytical resources. He said the sample size was too small to be statistically meaningful. He was not wrong about the sample size. He was also not right about what the pattern meant. By mid-2008, the Bowibu's new cross-directorate counter-espionage unit had almost certainly already begun its analysis of the CIA network's communication signatures. Source 12's 2007 silence was not a voluntary withdrawal, not a death, not an unrelated arrest. It was the controlled result of an identification process that had been underway for months. He had been found, not through his reporting, but through the statistical signature of how his communication channel moved data. The Bowibu had not arrested him immediately. They had watched him, built a template, and then used that template to look for matching signatures across every anomaly their new unit had been assigned to investigate. The CIA's network compartmentalization had been designed to prevent one asset from exposing another. It had never been designed to prevent one asset's communication pattern from exposing everyone else's. That was the flaw, not in the human architecture, in the technical one. And in 2008, with the network running at full capacity and Langley calling the priority reporting significant, nobody knew the flaw existed. The 16 remaining assets kept sending their signals. The Bowibu kept receiving them. And somewhere, in a unit that the CIA did not yet know existed, an analyst was building a map. Reardon's October contact cycle was routine. That word, routine, appears in his operational log 4 times in the entry dated the 3rd week of October 2010. He used it the way experienced handlers use it, not as a descriptor of complacency, but as a professional declaration. The cycle was scheduled. The protocol was unchanged. The channels were verified clean 48 hours prior. There was no elevated threat indicator in any of the preceding reporting from any of the 16 active assets. Routine. He initiated the contact sequence on a Tuesday morning. Staggered, as protocol required, each of the 17 channels pinged within a 72-hour window but separated by hours, sometimes by a full day, to prevent any single burst of activity from generating a detectable pattern at the network level. By Thursday evening, he had 4 responses. 4 was not, in the immediate moment, a number that triggered alarm. Contact cycles produced variable response rates. Assets operating under elevated local surveillance sometimes delayed their acknowledgment by days. The 3 assets Reardon had flagged years earlier for behavioral stress indicators had a documented history of irregular response timing. One of the 4 respondents was among those 3, which meant, by a specific kind of operational logic, that the response pattern was almost within expected variance. Almost. He waited the standard additional 24 hours, then another, then a third. 2 more responses came in on the second day, both from assets whose profiles he would have predicted to respond within the standard window. Their latency was unusual, but not unprecedented. 6 out of 17, in a network that had maintained near-perfect contact compliance for 3 years. He did not file an incident report that day. He told himself he needed another 48 hours of data before the non-response rate crossed the threshold that required formal documentation. This was not a violation of protocol. The threshold existed precisely to prevent premature escalation, to give handlers the space to distinguish between a bad week and a compromised network. He used the 48 hours. Nothing new came in. The incident report he filed on day 5 described the situation as a probable partial network disruption of unknown cause. That classification, disruption rather than compromise, was not a semantic accident. It carried specific procedural implications. A disruption triggers an investigation and continued monitoring. A compromise triggers a network-wide stand-down, a halt to all contact attempts, and mandatory escalation to the counterintelligence division. Reardon chose disruption. He had reasons. The 6 assets who had responded were, by every available indicator, operating normally. Their reporting product had come in clean, no signs of coercion, no anomalies in their communication behavior, no change in the substance or texture of what they were reporting. If the network had been systematically compromised, the working assumption was that some behavioral signal would be present in the surviving assets. There was none. His second reason was technical. The CIA's communications team ran a full diagnostic on the channel infrastructure within 24 hours of the incident report. They found nothing, no degradation, no interference, no anomaly that could account for 11 simultaneous non-responses, which meant the silence was human in origin, not mechanical. Human silence could mean arrest. It could mean voluntary withdrawal. The technical infrastructure being clean gave him the one thing he needed to justify not yet calling a stand-down: genuine uncertainty about cause. Where cause is genuinely uncertain, a stand-down is premature. That was his reasoning. It was the same reasoning his section chief applied when reviewing the incident report and approving continued monitoring without escalation. It was the reasoning that kept the remaining 6 assets active for another 6 weeks. On day 7, Reardon made a decision that the post-incident review would later examine at length. He sent a second round of contact signals to the 11 silent channels. Not to all 11 simultaneously, he selected 4, chosen by a logic that made complete professional sense at the time. He contacted the 4 whose silence was most anomalous given their individual risk profiles. The assets who, based on everything he knew about their operating environments, had the least reason to go dark. The decision was a false start disguised as a diagnostic. He was not trying to re-establish the network. He was trying to gather data, to determine whether the silence was total or whether one of the four might respond with a delay explanation that could help him characterize the disruption. A single response, with a credible explanation, would have shifted the probability calculus significantly. None of the four responded, but the signals had been sent, and each signal, even unanswered, had generated a detectable event in the communication infrastructure the Bowebu had spent 2 years mapping. Reardon did not know this. He recorded the non-response and noted that the absence of any acknowledgment, even a distress signal, was inconsistent with voluntary withdrawal. Assets who chose to stop communicating almost always sent some form of termination indicator. The silence was total. That was, he wrote, concerning. He used the word concerning once. Then he moved to the next entry. The South Korean NIS liaison made contact on day 9. The meeting was not formally scheduled. She called Reardon directly, which was unusual enough that he noted it before she said anything substantive. She had been running her own parallel review since the incident report had been shared with the liaison channel. She had pulled historical Bowebu counter-espionage case data, the same data the analyst had flagged in 2008, extended now by 2 additional years of documented cases. The pattern had not gotten smaller. She told him she thought the network was burned, not partially, fully. She believed the 11 silent assets had been arrested in a coordinated operation and that the 6 responding assets should be assumed compromised regardless of their apparent normal behavior. Reardon listened to all of it. He did not disagree with her analysis. He said so explicitly. He told her the hypothesis was credible, that he was taking it seriously. He asked her what evidence she had that the 6 respondents were compromised rather than genuinely intact. She said she didn't have direct evidence. She said the absence of a stand-down explanation for the 6, the fact that they were behaving normally in an environment where 11 of their unknown counterparts had simultaneously gone dark, was itself a suspicious indicator. He said she was right that it was suspicious. He said it was not, by the evidentiary standards required to trigger a stand-down, conclusive. She said she understood that. She said she thought the evidentiary standard was wrong. The meeting ended without resolution. Reardon filed a note in his log describing the liaison's position and his own. He flagged the entry for his section chief's attention. The section chief reviewed it 2 days later. He noted the NIS position, described it as premature, and confirmed the continued monitoring posture. On day 11, one of the 6 responding assets made an unsolicited contact. This had never happened before. The protocol was explicit. Assets did not initiate contact. The directional flow of the communication architecture was one way by design, handler to asset, on a fixed schedule, never reversed. An unsolicited contact was a protocol violation serious enough that it should, by any standard reading of the operational guidelines, have triggered an immediate stand-down. Reardon did not immediately stand down. The content of the unsolicited contact was brief and, on its surface, mundane. The asset reported a minor change in their local work schedule, the kind of administrative update that was occasionally included in regular reporting but never transmitted independently. There was no distress signal, no anomalous language, nothing that, taken in isolation, indicated coercion. Reardon spent 4 hours analyzing the contact. He ran it against the asset's known communication patterns. He checked the transmission characteristics against their historical baseline. He consulted with the technical team. Everything checked out. He recorded it as an unexplained protocol deviation, probably stress-related, and maintained the monitoring posture. He did not consider, at that moment, the one explanation that accounted for all of the available data simultaneously, that the asset was still communicating because someone else was making sure they did. That the normalcy was the point. That the Bowebu had learned, from 2 years of watching the network operate, exactly what a clean contact looked like, and had produced one. He was looking for a signal of distress inside a communication that had been specifically designed to contain none. The false release lasted 6 more weeks. In those 6 weeks, he filed 3 more incident reports. Each one moved, incrementally, toward the conclusion the NIS liaison had reached on day 9. Each one stopped just short of the stand-down threshold. Each one was reviewed and approved. And the 6 remaining assets, whether they were still free or already arrested, or somewhere in between in a process that the North Korean system does not document in ways the outside world can read, kept sending their signals. Until they didn't. The formal stand-down came on a Wednesday. Not because new evidence arrived, not because Reardon reached a conclusion he hadn't already been approaching for weeks. It came because the South Korean NIS, operating through a separate liaison channel above Reardon's section chief, escalated their assessment directly to a level that could not be absorbed into the monitoring posture without a formal response. The NIS had reached their conclusion 6 weeks earlier. They had communicated it twice through official channels and once in the meeting with Reardon. The CIA's internal review process had, each time, produced a qualified response that maintained operational continuity. The third escalation did not receive a qualified response. On the day the stand-down was issued, all contact attempts with all 17 channels ceased. The 6 assets who had been responding, whose responses had been the primary institutional justification for not calling the network burned, were formally reclassified as status unknown. The word disruption disappeared from the operational vocabulary of the case. The word compromise replaced it. The change in language took approximately 4 hours to process through the formal documentation chain. The damage it was documenting had been accumulating for 3 years. The immediate operational consequence was not the silence. The silence had already happened. The immediate consequence was what the stand-down revealed about the 11 days between Reardon's first incident report and the day he sent the second round of contact signals to 4 of the 11 dark channels. The CIA's technical team, now operating under the expanded mandate of a full compromise investigation, reconstructed the signal activity from that 11-day period. What they found was documented in a section of the post-incident review that former officials describe as the most uncomfortable reading in the entire report. Every contact attempt Reardon had made after day 1, every diagnostic signal, every re-ping of a silent channel, every attempt to generate a response that might help characterize the disruption, had produced a detectable event, not in the CIA's infrastructure, in the Boweeboos. The counter-espionage unit that had spent 2 years building a map of the network's communication signatures had been, during those 11 days, receiving a detailed picture of which channels the CIA considered worth recontacting, which assets were prioritized, how the handler responded to silence, how long the CIA would wait before escalating, what the escalation looked like in signal terms. The Boweeboo had learned, from Reardon's diagnostic attempts, how to make the next network harder to find by watching exactly how this one had tried to survive discovery. This finding, that the post-compromise contact attempts had provided counterintelligence value to the adversary, was the finding that the post-incident review described, in its precise institutional language, as the most consequential secondary effect of the case. It meant the damage was not limited to the 17. It extended forward, into future operations that had not yet been planned, against a threat environment that was now measurably more sophisticated than it had been before the network fell. The 6 assets who had continued to respond through the stand-down were never heard from again after contact ceased. There is no documented evidence of what happened to them. The NIS ran its own assessment and concluded, with moderate confidence, that at least some of the 6 had been in Boweeboo custody for weeks before the stand-down, that their continued communication had been managed, not genuine. The CIA's counterintelligence division reached a similar conclusion, qualified by the acknowledgment that the alternative could not be ruled out. That unresolved ambiguity is its own category of cost. If any of the 6 were still free when the stand-down was issued, if any of them had been waiting, for 6 weeks, for a handler contact that kept coming and then abruptly stopped, then the stand-down itself may have been the event that exposed them. A source who has been receiving regular contact and then receives nothing is a source whose behavior changes. behavior change is observable. In the North Korean system, observable behavior change has a specific and predictable consequence. The post-incident review does not resolve this question. It acknowledges it and moves on. There is nothing else to do with a question that has no answer. The intelligence gap opened by the network's collapse was not immediately visible as a gap. That is the nature of human intelligence loss in a denied area environment. You do not know, in real time, what you are no longer receiving. The reports stop coming. The analysts who had been incorporating the network's product into their assessments continue working, drawing on what they have, supplementing with signals, intelligence, and imagery, and the testimony of defectors whose information is often months or years behind the current operational environment. The gap becomes visible only later, when something happens that the assessments did not anticipate and the sourcing footnotes are reviewed, and someone notices that the confidence levels rested heavily on a human intelligence stream that no longer exists. Between 2010 and 2012, North Korea made several significant advances in its ballistic missile program. The assessments produced during that period were later reviewed and, in several cases, quietly downgraded. Their confidence levels revised to reflect the reduced human intelligence basis on which they had been constructed. This is confirmed in the public record through congressional oversight hearings, in which former intelligence officials acknowledged that the CIA's human intelligence capability inside North Korea was, in that period, severely degraded. A blind spot in that area, during that specific 2-year period, is not an abstraction. It is a concrete degradation of the United States government's ability to make informed decisions about one of the most consequential security challenges it faces. The cost of that degradation cannot be precisely calculated, but the people responsible for calculating it do not believe it is zero. The communication methodology that had been used to run the network, developed over years, refined through operational experience, believed to be among the more secure protocols available for denied area human intelligence operations, was now in the Bowibu's analytical archive. Every characteristic of it, every timing pattern, every statistical signature that the counter-espionage unit had spent 2 years documenting. It could not be reused. It could not be modified in ways that would make it safe to reuse. The Bowibu knew not just what it looked like in operation, but how the CIA responded when it started to fail. They had watched the response in real time for 11 days. They had a behavioral profile of how American intelligence handled a recruited asset network under terminal stress. That profile was more valuable, in certain respects, than the network itself. Reardon left the Korea posting in 2011. The post-incident review did not find him culpable in the disciplinary sense. It found that he had operated within his authority, within his training, within the institutional framework the CIA had built and never seriously questioned. It found the failure systemic, distributed across a chain of decisions made by multiple people at multiple levels, all of them reasonable given what each person knew at the time they made them. It also found, in language that former officials describe as unusually direct for this genre of document, that the stand-down decision had been available earlier than it was made, that the evidentiary threshold Reardon had applied, the threshold his section chief had endorsed, that the institutional culture had normalized, was set at a level that prioritized network preservation over asset protection in ways that the review considered an error of doctrine rather than an error of judgment. The distinction matters institutionally. It does not change what Reardon carried out of that posting. He continued his career. He worked other assignments in other regions. His professional record, in the years after Korea, is not a record of a man who was institutionally punished for what happened. It is also not a record of a man who worked again in a denied area human intelligence environment. Whether that was his choice or the agency's is not documented anywhere that has been made available. The 17 assets remain unaccounted for. They were not CIA spies. They were North Korean citizens who had entered into a clandestine relationship with American intelligence, people who had made a dangerous, deliberate, almost certainly terrifying decision to report from inside one of the most surveilled systems in human history. They carried the full weight of that decision alone, in their own name, in their own country. Every single day they remained active. No repatriation request has been acknowledged by Pyongyang. No names have surfaced in the records of known political prison facilities. Their families, to the extent they can be identified, are presumed subject to the regime's standard protocols for relatives of those accused of foreign espionage, a protocol whose consequences are documented and do not require elaboration here. A decade of work, 17 people, gone in 72 hours after 3 years of being slowly, methodically, invisibly found. The architecture that was supposed to protect them had a flaw that no one had thought to look for, because looking for it would have required questioning an assumption that had never failed before. That is not an excuse. It is not an exoneration. It is what happened. And the people who study these things, who build the next network, train the next generation of handlers, write the next protocol, are the ones who have to decide what to do with it. If you want to understand how intelligence really works, not the version that ends with a mission accomplished, but the version that ends with a file marked unaccounted for, this channel is where that history lives. Subscribe. The next operation is already in progress.